All right. Hello, everyone. This is Brooke Warner, and hi, Linda Joy.
Hi, Brooke, and welcome, everybody.
Welcome to a conversation about structure. We
Mm.
are thrilled to be teaching these super craft-oriented webinars lately. We had one on scene over the summer that was really well attended, and people were clamoring for more. So we are diving into structure, the backbone of your memoir, and just want to say a hello to all the familiar names out there. Thank you so much. And per usual, please do go ahead and put your questions in the question panel as we go, and we'll be addressing questions at the end. We're going to take a good 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So before we get too much farther along, we'll introduce ourselves for those of you who don't know us already.
I'm Linda Joy Myers. I'm the president of the National Association of Memoir Writers, and my memoirs Don't Call Me Mother. I have a new one coming out called Song of the Plains, and 2 books on craft, The Power of Memoir and Journey of Memoir. Great to be here with you.
And I am Brooke Warner. I'm the publisher of She Writes Press, the president of Warner Coaching, Inc., which is my coaching company where I help writers write and publish, and also the author of 3 books, Greenlight Your Book, What's Your Book, and How to Sell Your Memoir. And then we've co-authored Breaking Ground on Your Memoir, which is kind of an introductory book for memoirists, and also announcing that tomorrow is the pub date of The Magic of Memoir, Inspiration for the Writing Journey. And so we just had to get that in there because this book is something we're really excited about. We edited the book and it has 38 contributors, so it's an anthology, plus 11 interviews with best-selling memoirists, including Mary Karr and Elizabeth Gilbert and Danny Shapiro and others, and those are interviews that Linda Joy and I did with those authors. So we are pleased and happy to announce its birthday tomorrow.
Yeah, it's a happy birthday to the book, and
right.
And it's a book about inspiration, and it inspired us so much to read everybody's essays. From ordinary, regular memoirists as well as some well-known ones. And so hope you all enjoy it.
All right. And without further ado, we're going to dive into structure. What is structure and why does it matter? I mean, people generally come to us for coaching or come to our classes when they figure out that they have a structure problem. A lot of people start writing memoirs, writing scenes, or from journaling. And then what we find is that people have compiled scene after scene after scene, and it's in no real semblance of an order, or perhaps it's chronological, and they realize, like, this is kind of boring just to be reading, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. I mean, there are certainly craft elements that will make a linear memoir work in that way, but typically there is a really big question mark around structure for people because there's all these different kinds of structures and people don't quite know what to do with it. So I say here on the slide, without structure, your memoir can be hard to follow. Oftentimes that's just because you're not really following any kind of guideline and you're sort of shooting at the wind in a sense. And you'll end up with something that feels unwieldy because it is. Editors and agents know something is wrong, but they don't always know what. I had this experience a lot as an editor. I would look at a memoir and I would go, something isn't working here. And sometimes I knew it was a structural problem, but I didn't always know what the solution would be, or I knew it was just going to be so much work that I wasn't really able or willing to put the time and energy into it as an editor for a house, which is why memoirists especially need to work with editors to wrestle with their structure and figure that out long before you pitch your book to an agent or an editor. This question of structure really should be answered by you. I hope that by the time we're done with this webinar today, you'll be able to say, oh, I have that structure, or I'm going to work toward creating that structure so that you could present to someone and say, this is actually the structure of my memoir and I have thought it through. With structure, you can have more confidence in your narration. your story holds together better, and you'll have a more cohesive narrative. Now, that's because you're actually thinking about transitions and the flow of your chapters and identifying what goes where. The memoir is a big puzzle, and your job is to configure it. And there's no one right way. There are actually multiple right ways, but there are infinite wrong ways as well. And those wrong ways usually manifest themselves by you just going, this just doesn't feel quite right. I will put a little caveat in here to say be careful, because when you get to this place where you are struggling with structure, there is a definite danger of too many cooks in the kitchen. You know, there is absolutely this place where you can just get so much feedback from so many different voices, and you can lose a sense of what you should do, and people can have conflicting ideas about what your structure and your story should be. So when you are looking to work with someone, I really encourage you at this early stage to work with one person, or a teacher, or a coach, or a trusted mentoring partner in some way, so that you don't get messy and have conflicting opinions on this, because there ultimately can only be one structure you end up with. I want to encourage all of you not to overextend yourself. I'll give the example that someone in our memoir class, you know, she came out of an MFA program, and she had this great desire to have this very complicated memoir. She had just was holding a high bar for herself, and she did not want to have a linear memoir. And I kept reading the stuff telling her, you know, I really think that actually it's best suited to a linear memoir. And she was really opposed to that. And at the end of the day, she couldn't make it work. And so I felt that she was overextending and overcomplicating. There absolutely is merit in a linear memoir, and we're going to talk about the different structures and the kinds of structures. And they're great, especially if it's your first memoir, to just do the linear, but to remember that memoir is slice of life. A linear memoir is not, you know, my first memory happened when I was 4 years old, and then I went to elementary school, and then I went to high school, and then I went to college, and then I got married, and then I, you know, all those things, and then now I'm 65 years old. That's not a memoir. It's an autobiography, and that linear timeline in which everything in kitchen sink 2 is thrown in there, it's tiring for the reader. And the reason that, yes, it's linear, but it doesn't work for editors and agents either, is because we don't actually want the entirety of your whole life. So that's beyond the topic of structure, but linear does not mean whole life. An encouragement tonight to use the tools we introduce in this webinar. We're actually going to dive pretty deep into a lot of different content, and be willing to make changes that support new findings or the streamlining of your themes. But to also know when someone is giving you advice that does not ring true for you or just doesn't feel like a good fit. So we're teaching our students this all the time, you know, how to sort of stand true in what feels right to you, and to take in good feedback and stuff that feels resonant, but also to have enough of a sense of confidence and spine, for that matter, sometimes with agents and editors, to say, you know, actually that doesn't feel right for my book. And that's a hard thing to gauge sometimes. But an important thing to start to pay attention to.
I agree. I think, you know, we encourage people to be open-minded and take in the learning, and also to watch out for themselves, you know, and that's kind of an interesting balance to try to keep. Okay, so I'm going to talk about different tools that support creating your structure and having a structure from just knowing that you have a story. And the first one is to lay out your life, your whole life, actually. From your book isn't going to be your whole life, but a lot of people really need to do this exercise first, where you draw a timeline and then divide it by, I suggest you divide it by decades if you can, and then bring down these little bubbles, or the moments that have meaning. I'm going to talk much more about that in a second, that you're going to lay out on the different ages of how old you were. And so then once you do the one for your life, because most people have a lot of kind of overwhelming memories and they get in the way, then if you're clear on the structure, which we're going to be talking more about, or the time frame that you are going to use for your memoir, then you can do another time frame that, let's say it's 10 years or even 20 years. There are certain themes going on, and you're going to make that the focus of your story. And so you do another timeline for that. And let me talk about next, Brooke, turning points, because this is what's going to help you make that timeline. All right, so turning points are these moments of big change, or when things aren't the same afterward. We suggest you look at the big moments first. Obviously, your book isn't just going to be 5 big moments, but it's going to be a series of really big moments, sub-moments that are large, connected to your theme, and other moments that are going to be like interlocking and interlacing some of these bigger moments that you need to write about. And so you first you list those in the little bubbles of the timeline image that we gave you. And as you're doing that, you're going to be sorting through what you have, how much you have there. It's going to be usually way too much. Most people don't write us and say, gosh, I only have 4 memories. What shall I do? Now, a few people struggle with that, but most people just are overwhelmed with so much, and they're still figuring out their theme and how to boil things down. So you do ask yourself, how do these moments inform my theme? And so maybe your theme is recovering from a breakup or a divorce, let's say. Well, there are certain moments that are going to be about the breakup, but probably other moments are going to be perhaps in flashback about how you fell in love and how you wanted this person to be in your life, and then what happened that you changed. Things like that. I'm just giving an example. So in your theme, you're going to be looking at what moments make up that story. And this does begin to create the spine of your memoir. Between the timeline and the turning points, you'll have a really great running start. And I've been teaching turning points for about the last almost 20 years. And it helped me also in creating my own stories, my memoir. I still use it. All right, and then another way to keep track of your, that supports your structure is the scaffolding. The next slide, please. So we call this the Cliff Notes version of your story. And what it is an example. We've given you an example here of what it is. And so here's a moment in chapter 1. Here's the theme, horses coming back into my life. And then these 4 scenes that are going to show how horses came back into this woman's life. Walking into the barn, then there's a context in the next scene, which gives grounding, and context is so important so the reader can follow you, and so you can understand your story better as well. Then maybe there's a flashback, and then loss. And so there's like an arc here. We're going to talk much more about arcs in a few minutes. But this scaffolding, you can use it to plan out your chapters, or if you're not that kind of person, you just need to write for a little while, you will find you do need to come back to something like this, maybe after you've written a few chapters, and list what happens at the beginning, what is the chapter about, and how these scenes, you know, how you lay them out, and are they there? What is there? You do an analysis of what you've written. Truly, if you just write and write and write, you will get lost and drown. As Brooke said, we've helped a lot of people that come to us going, help, please help. So this is how you can help yourself even early on, and even if you've already written your story, you can use the timeline, the turning points, and the scaffolding as well. And the next tool, chapter titles and table of contents. And again, this is another great way to have a linear look at what you have. And so I mean, the thing about structure and the thing about a book is, obviously a book is linear. We read it line by line from beginning to end. But there's a horizontal structure that we're getting through, which is the plot and the story as it moves forward. And then there's this vertical experiential, the experience of the story that we're with. And a lot of times in our memories, that's what we're remembering, is the experience. And so we need these linear tools to help us do both, create the horizontal form and be able to go down and reach the emotion. So if you've got a working draft, having a table of contents already is great. You could even start labeling your proposed chapters as you're laying out your ideas. And this is not to create one of those outlines you did in high school. We are not trying to traumatize you like that. But even if you're a right brain, or especially, let's say, if you're a right brain person, you need to establish some kind of structure so you can keep moving forward and not get lost. So you have these chapter titles, and you start labeling your chapters. You can even create a folder called Chapter 1, Chapter 2 with the titles on them. And as you come up with your scenes and do your doodling and your notes, you can put them in that folder and have a very organized way of moving forward in your as you're writing. So these are all basic structures that help you with the writing itself and figuring out what you're going to do next. Okay, Brooke?
All right. So I'm going to talk about these different types of structures, which I put here into all these different little circles to get you thinking. Linear, braided, circular, framed, associative, and outliers. So the thing about structure, you guys might have some others. These are ones that we're very conscious of and that I'm going to talk about and give some examples tonight. And it doesn't mean that you might not read a memoir and say, this doesn't totally fit any of those other ones. And that's going to happen, you know, because there are people who are writing different things, and memoir is still a relatively new genre and it's still getting figured out to a certain extent. So, but that said, these are the ones that we feel pretty confident we know, and so we're going to give you some examples of those. So linear is what I was talking about earlier. It's a chronological story from point A to point B. And I'm going to be talking about a framed memoir in just a second, but the framed memoir tends to have a lot of flashbacks, and I'll explain why. But a chronological story is this, you know, I have a beginning and an end, and I'm just going to take you through this story. So Eat, Pray, Love by Elizabeth Gilbert is a great example of that, which is, you know, takes place over basically a year in which she travels to these 3 different countries and explores these, you know, different aspects of life. So there will always be backstory in a linear structure, but that's very different than really focusing on flashbacks like what often happens in a framed memoir. Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt is an example of a linear memoir because it's coming of age. And coming of age is largely a linear experience because of the nature of coming of age. It often starts anywhere from as young as 3 or 4 or 5, as was the case with The Glass Castle. Some people start at a younger, you know, at a little older age, like 9 or 10, and then it usually takes people into young adulthood, you know, 18 to 25 is pretty typical. So that's going to be an average trajectory. The main storyline is the now and what happens from one scene to the next. And I said, you know, this can be a year or it can be 20 years. It's not limited to a particular time frame per se. That said, remember that memoir is slice of life. And so what I was saying earlier about don't write a book that is, you know, I'm 5 and now I'm 65, the exception to that is when something is very thematic, and we'll talk about circular structures in a second. But for a linear memoir, I would say even 20 years is going to be too long unless it's coming of age and it's literally like 0 to age 20, which was the case with Angela's Ashes and Frank McCourt. So just keeping in mind what kind of story do you have and what are you, what structure is going to best fit it. Doing a lot of memoir reading can also really help you lock down the kind of structure that you might like to emulate. The thing about linear structure is that it's the easiest in some ways. It's the most straightforward. But, you know, many memoirs these days are doing other kinds of interesting structures. So let's look at what some of those are. The braided structure weaves together two, sometimes three parallel timelines, generally a past and a present. I say generally because I'm sure there could be an exception to that. It seems possible to me that you could be weaving together two, you know, more present timelines, by which I mean two adult timelines. So that's just something to consider. The possibilities for braiding happen every other chapter, past, present, or not. You know, you can certainly, I put like a music score, because the reason for that is because you'll see something which is like present, past, present, past, present. So it's not by any means that there has to be some formula, and the past, present might really work for you, or you might feel like that feels too formulaic and too forced. So the braided timeline is really up to you. And then I wrote here that sometimes a braided timeline meets up at a certain point. So the two timelines might meet and then continue on a present timeline together till the end of the book. You know, so for instance, there's a lot of memoirs, not a lot, but I would say a couple memoirs oh, funny enough, I have Raising Fences here as the image, but The Color of Water as the example. It is Raising Fences that I think is the interesting timeline. You know, he tells a lot of the story of his upbringing and his parents, and a lot of people are doing that more often lately, where they're doing a one braided timeline that is almost through the parents' perspective. It's unusual, but it's also happening a lot more in memoir. And so those two might meet up, right, in that the timeline of the parent and the timeline of the child could meet up at some point, you know, like when you're 20 years old, for instance, and then finish the memoir from, you know, age 20 to 25 together. So that's just something to consider. And then with Pieces of My Mother by Melissa Sestaro, I think it's a pretty straightforward, classic braided structure. And if this is an interesting structure to you, I highly recommend reading her book because of the way that she goes back and forth between the adult and the child narration, and it's quite powerful. The associative structure, just FYI, these are not things that you're necessarily going to find out in the world. Like if you go to a memoir course, you know, at Ohio or something and say, oh, I'm interested in associative. I mean, Linda Joy and I kind of came up with this because we started seeing books that were very theme driven and really driven by association and not so much by plot. And that's certainly the case for Devotion by Dan A. Shapiro. It's the case for Drinking a Love Story by Carolyn Knapp. Devotion is about devotion and just the ways in which it manifests in Danny's life. And Drinking a Love Story is about addiction and about a love affair with alcohol. Linda Joy's new memoir, Song of the Plains, is an associative structure. She's really using associations to move the reader through the book. And so it relies on turning points, big events, often thematic, to propel these books forward. And so if you know you have a highly thematic book, then the associative structure can be really helpful. I sort of think of it like stepping stones along a pond, you know, that you're looking out and kind of choosing which foothold to take based on the structures that we're talking about here, like turning points and things that have happened in your life, but that they're more based on, like I said, based on theme. They allow you to bounce around, and so that you're focused more on theme or idea or concept than timeline. And so this is a really powerful structure and certainly works for certain kinds of memoirs, but would be really almost impossible to pull off if you don't have something that you're exploring the nature of something, like devotion or like drinking. And so I want to caution with this one that it's not an easy one to pull off. But, you know, I certainly recommend all three of the memoirs that I mentioned, and Linda Joy's book will be available in June.
Oh, thanks for the
for the early plug.
Publicity there. Okay.
The frame structure, this is a popular one right now because of Wild, I think, where you choose a point in your life to focus on that comprises a beginning point, point A, and an end point, point B. But then stuff is happening all over the place. within that point A and point B, you are exiting the timeline as often as you want to fill in the backstory. So the reason that this is a little different than linear is because the reliance on memory and flashback is very heavy. You know, it's not just like Eat, Pray, Love, you know, where Elizabeth Gilbert goes on this year-long trip and she fills you in. You know, she's like, oh yeah, and by the way, I got divorced, and not, you know, oh yeah, and I have a niece and I have friends back home. The frame structure is really like full scenes are happening in the past. And there's a lot of context building. And point A to point B, again, it could be short or long, but I would argue that the shorter the better. You know, that it's like it's very well suited for things that are very high intensity kinds of things, like Cheryl Strayed's hike on the Pacific Crest Trail. But there are other examples. You know, I've read books by people who have taken trips around the world on a boat, for instance, that was done as a framed memoir, because the intensity of that experience is you want it to be condensed, you know, into this particular timeline, but then you want the freedom to be like, oh yeah, and that, you know, it's very informed by my upbringing. And so that is really, really well suited, again, to the framed memoir. I say that it makes use of memory and reflection, and we're not even going to talk about memory and reflection and what those things are, but on our website, we have written lots of blog posts about this. We have a place on our website called Get Wild because we taught this course, and there are articles there about memory and reflection from both of us that you can read if this is interesting to you. So if you have something that is kind of in the current timeline, very informed by your past, the frame structure can be incredibly helpful. So like I said, chronological, but just with a lot of backstory woven in. And this is a fun structure. The circular structure is if you have something that you keep coming back to a particular episode or meaningful point in the story. So 2 examples, The Liars Club by Mary Karr. It's really centered around this epic night where her mom threatened to stab her with a knife, and everything hinges on that night, even though the story itself is about so much more than that. It's a coming-of-age memoir, but it circles around on itself and just keeps coming back to this incident until finally it unravels and you discover something really interesting and profound about her mother at the end of the book. H is for Hawk by Helen MacDonald is centered around her father's death, and everything is informed by that episode or that incident. And so even though there's all this other stuff going around, she keeps circling back to that, and it's linear in a sense. I mean, there's some books like this that are both linear and circular in a sense, which is kind of awkward, or, you know, in the sense of teaching it, because it's difficult to say, well, how can it be both things? But I think if you read it, you will understand how that happens, and also because she integrates this other side story about T.S. White that is also somewhat circular in nature. So what this structure allows you to do is make departures to explore the terrain of your story, but often for the point of informing that central episode that's at the heart of the memoir. And then I said here, one form circular narratives take is called in media res, where the story begins in the middle of the action and then circles back around to explain this midway through the memoir. I want to say something briefly here about the fact that there is a huge trend happening in memoir right now to pull some crazy story or episode from the middle of your memoir to be the prologue of your book. And that happened in Wild, where in the prologue she throws the boot, or she loses her boot off the edge of the cliff. And then what happens is you catch up to it. That is actually what in media res is, but that's a different way of using it, because what that is specifically sort of episodically taking something super specific for the sake of engaging the reader, sticking it at the front of your book, and then going ahead and writing a linear or a framed memoir. So I don't want anyone to think that just because you do that, you're writing a circular structure. You're not. But that is a trend right now in memoir, and lots of people are doing it. Before we move on really briefly, I just want to say something quickly about Outliers, because I did say that outliers are kind of anything else, you know, that doesn't quite fit, like the memoir in essay, for instance, you know, which is basically a series of essays. They're less popular and they're sometimes experimental. So I want to acknowledge that there are outlier structures, but that these are the main 5 that we see students attempting to execute.
And what most books do, though,
yes.
You know, maybe new forms are being invented as we speak. It's possible. All right, so, you know, the other thing that is helpful to know is what is a traditional story arc, because you don't have to get, sometimes like Brooke's example, if you try to get too fancy with what you're doing, you can get really tangled up and lost and very, very frustrated, and we would want you to not have to go through that. So I'm going to talk about the traditional story arc. Many of you have heard of this before, but it will be new to some of you. And so the first is the first definition is chronological construction of a plot composed of exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. And I'm going to say what each of those are because it just helps to know the definition. So an exposition is the introduction and the context of the story, the introduction of characters and the situation. And I have to say that in a lot of memoirs that I give feedback on, people forget to do this. You can start right in the middle of something, but you do need to still give context and introduce characters so we understand what's going on and not just a bunch of names or a bunch of people running around without any understanding of who they are to the main protagonist, which is you. Then the next thing is the rising action. And so these are a series of events that complicate whatever the situation or problem or challenge is that the protagonist is going through. And of course, in a memoir, the protagonist is you. You are the protagonist of that story, and we will see you change over time. I'm going to talk more about that in a second. Climax is the point of greatest tension in the story, and it's a turning point to what's called the falling action. And after the climax, in the falling action, events unfold, and there's a release of tension leading toward resolution. So these are energetic things. I'm going to show you a diagram of this in just a few moments. So the release of tension leads to resolution, and in resolution is the end of the story, usually with problems solved, or at least some kind of sense of completion. It can be as vague as like an out breath, or, you know, just a sense of completion somehow that you manage to create with your language. So I just think it's really good to review these things. You can look these terms up on the internet. They're all out there. You can read a whole bunch of different things about them. And I think it's a good thing to keep in mind, because I think memoirists go, well, I already know what I'm going to do with my story because I lived it. But you still, when people say a memoir needs to be a story, this is what they're talking about. And I think it's easy to forget that. Also, memoirs have plots, and again, that's something we kind of kid about. We know what happened, but it is the forward action. In a plot, it's what happens, and then what happens after that, and what happens after that, and it's very much connected to cause and effect. So that's particularly why in, for instance, a coming-of-age memoir, this happened, which led to that, which led to that. If you try to skip around too much, we won't understand the context of whatever the young person is going through, because, you know, they went through it linearly, and we grow up linearly, and in a lot of our stories we shift and change because this happened, and then after that, that happened. So don't be afraid of that. You don't have to get too fancy to do a really great memoir where it's solid and we're grounded and we're really following you. Also, there's character development, of course, in a memoir. It's you, the protagonist, making sense of what happened and how you're changed by it. Other people, some of your secondary characters may also change, and you will be observing that more than anything because you're not in their head. in a memoir, but a protagonist is the energy that drives through a story, and that's you in a memoir. So then there's also a character arc in the memoir. This is part of that change. And then this is one way to look at it. There's many different ways of people write about this, but it's about a protagonist having a struggle and entering a low point, or I like to call it the dark night of the soul, and finding a way to learn from that struggle, to recognize that it is a struggle that has to be dealt with. And ultimately, that leads to some kind of new path in life or new decision, a new something, and that's part of the resolution. So let's look at the way this looks in a diagram, Brooke. So, and again, you can see this around on the internet and stuff, and it's part of some books on, I'll give you a couple names of books in just a minute, but you have the opening scene, you have that horizontal time frame, and the traditional story arc is considered to have 3 acts, a beginning, middle, and an end. That said, it's way more complicated than that, as we know. Where do you begin? What's the middle about, and how do we determine the end? And especially for memoirists, we're going on and living our lives. You know, you have to bring that your life doesn't end, but the story has to end. And like we were talking about before, the beginning sets up a context. There's a situation, there's a problem, there's a question, there's something happening, something that is starting the engine of the story going. And then there's a series of crises. I have a friend who teaches plot, Martha Alderson. Her book is Plot Whisperer. And she talks about the things that are going on above this horizontal line, and those are the things that happen. And she has you chart out what goes on below that line, and what she says goes on below the line is the inner changes that go on. So it's not just what happened, it's how what happened affects you. And everybody responds to these you know, kind of images and teachings in a different way. But we like to say whatever works for you that will get you unconfused and moving forward in your story, we encourage you to use it. And in the middle, you'll see these little crises, little mountain bumps building up. And if you look at stories that are page turners that you enjoy, or stories that just keep you reading, really what's happening, and some of them might be more subtle than others, there's a series of moments that build, and we keep reading to find out how they turn out and what happens. And then it leads to some kind of climax. There's the feel. You've read a book, you know, where the feeling builds and builds and builds towards something. And in an action book, obviously there's a big car crash or something, which we're not talking about here, but there's an emotional climax. There's a you know, a moment when all these little pieces start to come together in the story, and you begin, in a memoir particularly, to have new insights as you reach the climax and move down into the denouement. And that little curve can be long and kind of linger down further to the right there, or it might be a very sudden drop off, a little bit like Glass Castle does, something like that. We all have to find a way to do that, and it's a little bit of a challenge to, you know, to figure out exactly how to end it. But, you know, so many people that we work with say, well, you know, I don't know how it ends, and that's okay. Work with the building of the structure, like we're talking about, your timeline, your exercises, your scaffolding, and also we encourage people to journal on, well, I think I can write it to this point, and then I think it might end here. And if you do that for a few weeks or months, you're working your way toward understanding what the ending could be, even though you don't know it early on. So we just find these tools so very helpful. We can put this in the chat window, but I want to give another name for a helpful book too, and it's called Scene and Structure. It's an old book it's been around for a long time, through Writer's Digest books, but it's very helpful. And you can also look online for books on structure. There's various books out there, and what helps one person isn't so great for another. So see what makes sense to you. Anything to add, Brooke? Okay.
Just an important reminder. Yeah, you can't take advice from anyone and necessarily think that it's going to apply to you. I think we've reiterated that tonight, but it's particularly important with structure, and we'll get into it in a second too in the Q&A. So we always do these free webinars and welcome everyone so much to only do free webinars with us, but it is also an opportunity for us to tell you about our longer programs. And we are starting a new Write Your Memoir in 6 months on January 4th. So this is just a really quick plug to tell you about it. If you're on the call tonight or registered for the call tonight, you can get $150 off. I think we actually only have about 5 spots left. So we do anticipate filling them. And that's actually 5 spots of 28 students, because we run 2 back-to-back classes every other Wednesday, and we cap those classes at 14 students. So there's a ton of details online on our site, writeyourbookin6months.com/program details. And we, in the interest of getting to the Q&A, if you have a specific question about it, we'll deal with it in the Q&A, but there's a lot of information online, and we're highly reachable. So if you want if you have specific questions about it, just shoot me an email and take advantage of the discount. So
yeah, look forward to any of your questions and having you join us if you're ready to have an intensive workout with your book.
Yeah, I'm excited to get started with a new class. So, all right. So I'm going to move on to the Q&A. We have our social media links and other stuff. Both of us are all the time talking about memoir. So let's see. Becca's asking for the discount link. So please just go to writeyourbookin6months.com and then to program details. It's on the home page. And just want to make a quick note that we take the discount out of the contract. So you would put in your deposit, and then we'll work with you to the discount comes out on the contract end. Okay, so let's dive in. There's so many questions, and this is exciting and awesome. I'll leave up this link for a minute, and then I'll move back to the social media stuff. So I actually love this. Someone emailed this in advance, so I'm going to take it, and I think it's so pertinent to the publishing journey. She writes, I wrote a narrative memoir about my marriage as encouraged by my mentor during my MFA. She insisted that it's what the publishers wanted, easier to sell. It certainly wasn't the easiest and clearest way to write the story. Then I hired an editor to critique the manuscript, and she suggested I work more thematically rather than chronologically, which involves a massive structural reorganization. And then, so basically it's kind of what we're talking about tonight. She said, I could also leave it as is, try to find an agent. I'm overwhelmed. I'm swimming with 280 pages. What do I do? This is tough, and I really want to let you all know that this is going to happen to you on your journey. It always happens that someone is going to read your stuff and decide that they would prefer that you do it differently. So be conscientious about that. As I was saying earlier, the reason that I said it to preface the call tonight is because it comes up especially with structure, where people will read like 50 pages of your book, and then they'll say, I think you should reorganize the whole thing. I can't tell you, all the time. So if you're at a place where you're just really overwhelmed with your structure and you're not sure what to do, it's a good time to get an assessment. To have a professional person read the book all the way through and give you a sense of what's working and not working. And then perhaps, if you're really stuck on structure, to say, is this okay or not? Because what I would say to this woman, Jennifer, is possible that the linear and the chronological are okay. And that neither one is necessarily better than the other. And what matters is the scenes and the takeaways and a million other things we teach in our class. And that you're going to find people who are just super keen to change your memoir for essentially no reason other than they think it would be better. So, be careful. Be careful. All right. So let's see. let me see about, oh, someone's asking if you could put the names of those books in the chat window. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
And then, okay, so someone's saying that she'd like to hear an example or two, Sarah, of outlier structures. And I will give you a couple examples. One is like people like David Sedaris, you know, who just write like a memoir and essays, for instance. There is a experimental memoir, I think it's experimental anyway, that I worked on at Seal Press while I was there, called Purge. That is basically like when you have snippets of, you know, it was about rehab. And so she used bits and pieces from her rehab experience and journals, and you know, it was poetic, and it had you know, entire chapters written in the second person, but not only in the second person. So things like that that are experimental memoirs are outliers. I would also say the memoir Another Bullshit Night in Suck City, which is a popular book, and I think it's an outlier because it's very unusual. But they just don't quite fit. So that's what I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Tons of you are asking about the slides and if I will send you the slides. I'm going to find a way to upload them so that I'm not just sending out a PDF file. So I'll figure that out. So the answer is yes. Evelyn says, Linda Joy, could a coming of age memoir be mostly linear with a few thematic chapters interspersed?
Yeah. I totally relate to the question. There are stories, and mine's one of them actually, where you're moving forward in time and yet you're using themes like, you know, certain themes of, I think yours is a travel book. If it's the Evelyn, I think it is. You know, where certain things are learned, or there's certain you know, connections made, and moving forward, you know, there will be something different, a different theme. And so you can do that. Just make sure that you do a scaffold, or, you know, some way of doing an inventory to make sure you're keeping track of what happens when. In my recent book, I did it that way, and then one chapter suddenly slipped from its moorings and was in the wrong place, and therefore it didn't make sense in the way that it needed to. So I had to both take it out and rewrite it. And so as you're going through the later stages, you'll discover that. And I found it out through doing an inventory of every chapter, and that's how I discovered it. So good luck with that.
All right, great. Phyllis says, I'm participating in NaNoWriMo. For those of you who don't know about it, it's National Novel Writing Month, where you're trying to write a ton of words in the month of November.
50,000 words in 30 days, yeah.
She says, I have written 10,000 words up to this point, and I have a total of almost 40,000 words toward my memoir. I have a very loose structure of categories or chapters in Scrivener, and I feel like I'm all over the place. Should I stop participating in NaNoWriMo? Well, so I think that not necessarily. I mean, you should stop participating in NaNoWriMo if you feel like you're completely overwhelmed, yeah, and unanchored. But if you can just look at it as an opportunity to create scenes, and if you can structure them in some way in Scrivener and label them as turning points, you know, maybe start to use the turning point exercise to say, you know, these are major events that you can label and then puzzle together later. I mean, if you're getting a lot of words done because of NaNoWriMo, I wouldn't stop, but I would stop if you feel like it's detrimental to your process.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, to make a list of a few more significant moments that you can continue to write about, one scene, one chapter, or one scene at a time, and list the date and where you are, and be really grounded. Then you could get a lot of scenes done. There'll be rough drafts, but you'll know when and where you are, and you can then puzzle, you know, like a puzzle, you can fit it together afterward.
All right, great. And then Ainley asks, how do we get from general life timeline to specific thematic timeline?
Yeah, that takes us to the issue of theme. All right, so you know, let's talk about theme for a second. So theme is when somebody says, what is your book about, you know, as best you can, try to answer it in a few sentences. It's about the time that I just did a bunch of reading of memoirs. So let's say it's about the time that I got a new dog and the dog and I had to learn how to live together and work together. Okay, that can be a theme for your whole book. Another one is a lot of people are writing about you know, recovery. So my book is, you could say my book is about, you know, trying to work things out with my parents over about a 30-year period, and finally whatever the ending is. If you can throw a big net around the smaller details, it'll help you think about your theme, and then you try to put your turning points within that theme. And you might have several themes, but that's okay. You can sketch out what scenes and chapters go with one theme and what go with another one. It's mostly just trying to get a bit linear and not have it float around in your head in all the magnificent memory details that you all have.
Yeah, good response.
Yeah.
All right.
Really confusing.
So here's one that I love to answer, which is, would you please talk about fictionalized memoir?
Oh, yeah.
If you've ever heard us speak before, and this comes up all the time, the fictionalized memoir is a novel. So really, if you are writing a fictionalized memoir, you don't have to worry about the truth. And in memoir, you absolutely have to worry about the truth. And there can be disclaimers, and there can be composite characters, and there can be composite scenes. You know, so there's some degree of, you know, you're not going to remember everything perfectly, and therefore, Linda Joy and I teach in our classes, what really matters is the emotional truth, but you can't make things up. Whereas in fictional work, you can. And publishers don't believe that there's such a thing as fictionalized memoir. I mean, there is, but again, it's called a novel, and you can just shop the book as a novel, and a lot of times you'll see that a novel is based on a true story, and you know, that's a memoir at the heart of a story, but it's important that you all understand that in publishing, they're two totally separate genres. Okay, so April says, tips on finding balance with happy, sad moments in a memoir. This is a good one for you, Linda Joy. I'm focusing on defining moments, but don't want it to come off to the reader as if I'm telling them about everything bad that happened to me.
No, right, exactly. I work with this a lot. So, I mean, I suggest that you make actually a list. I do this in my Power of Memoir book, actually go into it in quite a lot of depth, but you make a list of the happier, more joyful moments. You make a turning point list of those, and you make a separate turning point list of the darker moments. And for each of these, you still include the important things like where you were, how old you were, what year it is, and what happened in a sentence or two that's significant, because you're not probably going to include all of any of those either. And then you lay them on your timeline, and you can visually, even you can color code it, you know, darker moments are blue and lighter moments are yellow, and it helps to have a visual layout. And then you begin to weave together. I had to work with that a lot, especially in Don't Call Me Mother, because it's a coming of age book about 3 generations of mothers who abandon their daughters, and there are some heavy stuff. There's some heavy stuff in there, so I made sure that a darker chapter was followed by a lighter one, and I wove them throughout. So good luck with that. It's important.
Yeah, thanks. And Sally is asking for the outlier slide. There wasn't an outlier slide, and that's just because outliers are outliers, and they're not anything.
They don't get a slide.
They don't get a slide, exactly. They're not anything that I would recommend following. You know, if you have an outlier structure, I simply included it because you might be like, well, I'm doing something different. And that's fine. It's not to say like, oh, you're doing something different, so you better change it. We're not into that. But we also would not advise, if you're trying to figure out what your structure is, to try to do an outlier, because it just doesn't make sense. And for the perspective of the industry, it's not a very saleable kind of memoir. Like a memoir in essays is a popular form, but it's popular among people who are incredibly famous and who are essayists. And it's not something that, you go, oh, yay, I did a memoir and essays. The publishers are going to be like, great, we don't think we can sell it. So it's just understanding that, if it's something that you're hoping to sell to a publisher. And then there was another question in here about whether you could write your memoir diary style. I would say not. Because again, publishers just don't really like that. And I think I personally am bored to tears by reading people's long entries that are journals and letters. And so whenever I see that, I always tell people, really excerpt just the most profound piece of the diary or the letter, and then summarize the rest and think about what's in it for the reader. Because if there isn't anything and it's just your journaling, which typically is not for other people but for you, then it's probably not going to work as a long form.
And we teach something called takeaway. Some of you have heard it a million times, but you need to think about what will the reader take away with them and learn from it. And most of the time in diaries and journals, the answer is not much. Because you're processing it. You need to translate your process so the reader understands it, and that means you need to write about it.
Yeah, exactly right.
Story form, and show it. Show, not just tell, also.
You're right. So this is a question about the course, which I'd like to address, which is, will there be critiques of the writing along the way? And if you miss a webinar, will it be accessible online? So yes and yes. I mean, we have a very, very regimented thing going on with critiquing your work. I can explain more about it, separately, but we read 2,500 words for every class. We give you an evaluation. We go through this in depth on our orientation, and we record everything we do. And we always make it available. It's so funny because whenever we do one of these webinars, I get like 75 emails from people asking if it's going to to be available later. Yes, always and forever. We love to make our stuff.
Headlines on our website or something.
Yeah, so we always record because, people have busy lives, and we understand that you can't make every single class, but we love people to be there live because we share and we do writing exercises and all kinds of stuff. So that's just something to get clear on. Okay, so Kim says, I have over 100,000 pages. I hope you mean words, hon. Oh my gosh, 100,000 pages is so much. They are all different scenes, and my task is to make some coherence out of them into a structure. Again, I really hope it's 100,000 words for your sake, and what I would recommend is to do an inventory. So it's really just to go comb through all of those and try to inventory every single scene that you have. If you don't have scenes, try to figure that out, and just identify by kind of the what happened. Because if you have that much content, like we had someone from our Magic of Memoir conference stand up last year and say, I have a 200,000 word book, which is like 3 books. And she said, by the time I finish reading it, I can't remember what happened in the beginning. And of course, right, it's too long. And so taking an inventory of what you have, this Cliff Notes version, like what Linda Joy taught tonight, will help you get that bird's eye view. And then you can start to patch together some semblance of an order using the inventory as your guide.
Yes, that's the answer.
We have a question about associative structure, and maybe you could take this, Linda Joy, just kind of, sometimes it can just be heard better from a different perspective, feeling like it's a little unclear what we mean by it.
Yeah. Well, basically, so it is hard to explain, actually. Let's say you have a topic like loss, and you have some other parts of the loss. I'm going to talk about an example with my book because I think that's the easiest way to do it. So my new book is about my family, where these generations of women abandon their daughters, how I tried to make sense of it. Another layer of that theme of trying to make sense is realizing that people were always either lying to me or leaving everything out, and how all of my life I was trying to figure out what they were leaving out. And I became like a sleuth. And so it's, how did I become a sleuth? What was actually happening? And what did I think about this stuff? And what was I unsatisfied with in terms of the answers? And how did that drive me through my life to find out the answers, and what I went through to find out the answers only fairly recently in my life? So in a given chapter, I would weave from what was happening to what bothered me, to what I was curious about, and then how was I going to survive certain things that were going on. So there might be 3 different themes weaving through the chapter. So it's not like one chapter was just about one thing. And then in the narration and reflection, which we're not going to teach tonight, but we do teach it in the 6-month course, my reflections sent out little armies of arms reaching out to other pieces of the theme. I would just seed them. We talk about seeding a lot in the class. So we are sometimes seeding things in one chapter that will be harvested later on. And so an associative memoir is that's the way it is constructed. And mine is thematic, and so it really works to do it that way. Because I didn't want to do a frame structure. There's flashbacks in there. There's various things. So it has themes and forward motion. I don't know if that answers the question very well.
But it's really good, yeah. And I can't believe how many good questions there are here, and we're out of time. And so I'm going to, I'll post these questions, some of the stronger ones. We can put them on our Facebook page, because some of these are really pertinent, and I would love to be able to share them with you guys, and I think that's a good forum for it. So find us online at, on both Facebook and Twitter, and we can answer some of these questions there. And it gives us more fodder for future webinars as well. But I also recommend our Breaking Ground on Your Memoir. It's a tiny little book. I think it's like 150 pages, and it packs a punch. I mean, if you guys just have general questions about structure and craft, it can be a really good place to start, and it's not overwhelming. I mean, we've gotten good feedback that it's quite accessible, because some of the questions that I'm seeing in here are I know they're answered in that book. So thank you. My goodness, you guys are an amazing group with so many good questions, and looks like a really lots and lots of works in progress. So you can absolutely email me directly just in response to the link that went out today. You all have my email address, especially if you're interested in the course and you're curious about specifics. And we will see you next time around. Thanks.
Yes,
and thanks,
thank
Linda
you so
Joy.
much. Yes, thank you so much for being here. Bye-bye.
Have a great night.